Contrary to popular belief, the ancient world was not as primitive and illiterate as we make it out to be. In fact, as we explore the Roman period, we uncover a surprisingly rich landscape of literature filled with works of fiction and fantasy, with genres ranging from adventure to romance, comedy, proto-science fiction, and more. So today, let's explore what the Romans were reading, and have our friend Daniel Greene share his thoughts on one of these fascinating works. You can learn much more about the topic of ancient literacy through our sponsor, Magellan TV. I highly recommend the documentary The Professional Class of Rome, which does a fantastic job exploring how people of the past navigated their world. Specifically, it covers aspects of administration and how the vast extents of the Roman Empire were managed by written records, some of which have survived to this day. It's a great way to experience the past from the cold north of Britannia to the arid east of Syria. Documentary videos like this are added weekly to Magellan TV, which already has a collection of over 3,000 videos to choose from among the categories of history, science, nature, space, and more. You can watch The Professional Class of Rome, or any documentary that catches your interest by clicking the link in the description below, or going to try.magellantv.com/invicta to get a 1-month free trial. Enjoy! But before we look at what the Romans were reading, I'd like to talk about who was reading in the first place. However, even today, estimating literacy rates can be quite difficult to pin down. This is even more true when it comes to antiquity. Much academic debate surrounds the subject of literacy in the Roman world, with ranges varying greatly from low model estimates of around 1% to high model estimates of around 20%. Naturally, these figures will rise and fall depending on definitions, time periods, locations, and demographics. Probably the most influential historian in this field is William Harris, who wrote the book Ancient Literacy in 1989. In this work, he turns to many sources, including rural literacy data from the 19th century, to construct a model for the past. One of his main conclusions is that, quote, "the likely range for the overall literacy level of the Roman Empire under the Principate is almost certain to have been under 10%. Even in the most advanced cities, the level of literacy, including women and country people, is far below 50%. Yet while Harris's work is certainly a solid way to begin exploring this topic, it should be noted that it is certainly missing the more recent developments in how the academic world looks at literacy. As is always the case when crafting hypotheses about such nebulous topics, there is much debate. Simply defining what literacy means can be difficult. Do you have to read and write? To what level of proficiency? In what quantities or frequency? And how do oral traditions factor in? Even if you do agree on criteria, the evidence we have to go on is limited, anecdotal, and open to interpretation. Is graffiti in a public restroom proof of literacy? How about the use of seat numbers on sporting tickets, writing spells in curse tablets, or the signing of names on military rosters? And what of the reported practice that children learn their letters from recitations of literature, such as Virgil's Aeneid, and that often people simply preferred to listen rather than read? As you can see, it's easy to start going down a rabbit hole here. Proponents of higher literacy rates certainly do have a case to make, and it will be worth discussing this briefly. One popular example is the examination of graffiti in the city of Pompeii. It's scratched out on virtually all available surfaces, with everything from jokes to insults, ads for prostitution, and rewards for the return of stolen goods. But this sort of everyday writing isn't just limited to bits written passingly by the locals or by tourists either. There are painted posters promoting games, political campaigns, and shop signs everywhere. Given their sheer ubiquity and the reliance on text, it certainly seems like the creators were writing for an audience which they expected to be literate. Such a mindset also appears when we look at Roman laws and decrees. In many cases, they include clauses requiring their public display. Here is a relevant excerpt from the Lex Irnitana, which states that the law must be, quote, inscribed in bronze and affixed in the most highly trafficked area of the city, so that it might easily be read from the ground level. On top of this, you can look at trends of bureaucratization, socioeconomic factors, and more. Honestly, we could easily get mired in debates over literacy rates for quite a while. But for the sake of this video, we can leave things here, with the understanding that literacy was likely higher than we might expect at the outset. This included not just the elite ruling men, but women, commoners, and even slaves. So now we can ask, Just what kinds of things were the Romans reading? Well, as we mentioned, this could vary greatly from bits of graffiti to ads, directions, and more. But the more specific types of reading we're interested in today will be literature in the form of letters, poems, and books in prose. Letters were among the most common forms of written work, as they were used by people from all walks of life to communicate with one another at a distance. These might be written on anything from papyrus to wax tablets, wood slivers, and more. Extensive systems of public and private couriers in turn shuttled these across the Roman world and beyond. Many of these letters have since been lost. However, a tiny fraction have survived, being found in deserts, bogs, or other mediums of preservation. Through their examination, we uncover conversations frozen in time. One is from a woman inviting a friend to her birthday party. One is from a mother to her son, chiding him for not having written to her in 3 months. And yet another is from a soldier asking his brother to send him a couple pairs of socks on the front. Eventually, the practice of letter writing evolved from a private means of correspondence to a public genre of literature. This appears to have begun around the 1st century BC with the deaths of Cicero. His slave, secretary, and friend, a man named Tiro, published Cicero's vast collection of correspondences posthumously. The private thoughts and musings of such an elder statesman went viral through the Roman world, influencing other major figures for centuries. Other collections of letters are much more obviously curated and written for a wider audience. For instance, where Cicero's letters are quite genuine and mundane, the published works of Pliny and Seneca tend to be far more premeditated and full of philosophical musings meant to impart a desired message. Such works would be widely copied and circulated over the centuries, which is why we have records of them today. Another form of literature consumed by the Romans was poetry. This was actually a quite broad category, spanning from long epics to short witticisms. On one end of the spectrum were narrative poems, which tell stories typically in metered verse. They were commonly recited out loud as a form of entertainment in an episodic format spread out over the course of several days and weeks. Among the most famous were the epics of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. Ovid's masterpiece, the Metamorphoses, was also an influential one, whose 15 books chronicle the history of the world from its creation to the deification of Julius Caesar within a loose mytho-historical framework. Such works were so popular that they seem to have made their way into the standard curricula of schoolchildren as tools for learning to read and write. On the other end of the spectrum were the short-form poems. Compared to their epic brethren, these were far easier to produce and to consume. Some were certainly more highbrow and Victorian in nature, like Virgil's Bucolius. However, the more popular ones tended to be more humorous and lowbrow, often making snappy jokes at other people's expense and generally using obscene language. Sex jokes were par for the course, as were jokes about gold diggers, people's looks, and the mysterious deaths of husbands. Martial was famous for writing over 1,500 witty epigrams that offer a rare glimpse into daily life in the past. Here are a few select examples. You feign youth lateness with your dyed hair. So suddenly you are a raven, but just now you were a swan. You do not deceive everyone. Proserpina knows you are gray-haired. She will remove the mask from your head. I felt a little ill and called Dr. Symmachus. Well, you came, Symmachus, but you brought 100 medical students with you. 100 ice-cold hands poked and jabbed me. I didn't have a fever, Symmachus, when I called you, but now I do. And this one is the last edgy favorite. Quote, with your giant nose and cock, I bet you can with ease, when you get excited, check the end for cheese. Were Martial and other famed Roman poets alive today, I am sure that they would have a field day on Twitter and social media. But for their time, they enjoyed quite wide circulation through the distribution of cheap poetic compilations. Another major form of literature read by the Romans were books written in normal prose. Just as today, these came in all kinds of forms. For instance, you could find non-fictional genres of history, biography, and educational works on agriculture, estate management, horse breeding, and more. Such was their popularity that authors even began to satirize these standard forms. Lucian, for instance, was particularly prolific in this capacity. One of his most well-known works is The True Story, which was written to make fun of the outlandish tales penned by the likes of Herodotus and Thucydides. This book considered to be the first science fiction text ever written, tells the tale of how Lucian and his crew sailed over the western horizon at such an angle that they flew to the moon. There they got involved in a war between the aliens of the dark side and the light side. After this, they sailed back to Earth, where they promptly got eaten by a sea monster and were entangled in fish politics. It eventually ends abruptly with promises of future sequels which were never delivered, leaving us with a 2,000-year-old cliffhanger. While satirical works could be dripping in pointed commentary, other books just aim to give you a solid laugh. The Golden Ass by Lucian is a prime example. It tells the tale of a man who attempts to perform a spell which will transform him into a bird, but which accidentally turns him into a donkey. In this form, he goes on a long journey filled with hijinks and other embedded tales, until finally being saved by the goddess Isis. We actually collaborated with our friend Daniel Greene to do a book review, which you can check out in full on his channel. For now, we'll let him give you a quick clip of his take.
My biggest complaint with reading this book comes with a fairly obvious one, but they wanted me to give you the modern perspective, so this is a modern perspective review. The actual structure and narrative of this book is the most stream of consciousness thing I have ever read in my life. It actually starts out with the author telling you who the narrator is going to be and their position in society. And the author himself keeps putting things from his real life in this book, and I only knew that because after a certain point I had to figure out why certain elements kept being touched on, like locations and people, and it's because they were prominent in the guy's life. This is the fantasy novel equivalent of having someone just trying to make up a story that they're somewhat related to, but not the protagonist of. The donkey bangs a woman and then is going to bang a murderess as a part of her punishment for being... I'm uncomfortable again. Let me tell you what I liked the most about The Golden Ass, and what I found to be uniquely valuable here. Reading a piece of fiction from an ancient time gives you a grounded perspective that I personally have never come across from any other Roman text that I've read. Because you're not only getting creativity from the mind of someone who existed in ancient Rome, but there's the influence of the world around this man directly impacting his story. It gives you this neat little fly-on-the-wall perspective that you can make through assumptions of a lot of the world around the character and therefore the author. The Golden Ass is absolutely a must-read because it's going to give you something you cannot get anywhere else, and I feel maybe somewhat more connected to this society than I ever have before.
In his full review, you can check out how Daniel does a great job relaying the impressions of a modern critic and really highlights how alien the book feels, falling almost in an uncanny valley of sorts compared to the novels of today. Definitely check out his channel for more great literary content. Other adventure stories, like the Aethiopica, make for more serious, gripping reads. It tells the tale of a Nubian princess who was born white and abandoned by her mother for fear of being accused of adultery. However, the baby was left with 3 gifts, including a magical ring of fire protection, and was later rescued by a man who eventually brought her to Delphi, where she became a priestess. Soon she falls in love with a Thessalian noble, and the two embark on a wild adventure to find her place of birth, encountering pirates, bandits, and all kinds of dangers along the way. The romantic thread in this novel can be seen weaving its way through many other works. Some lean more heavily on this topic, and would certainly belong in the romance section of a bookstore. One of these, a quiet and gentle story called Daphne and Chloe, includes many tropes echoed across the ages. In it, 2 children, both noble but abandoned and found by shepherds, grow up and fall in love. They stumble through awkward, youthful romance with episodes of pirate raids, buried treasure, and competitions to win the hand of the girl. Classically, the story ends with them together, living happily ever after. It should be noted that the majority of these works we've mentioned so far only survive in Greek. This is owed both to the prominence of Greek in the Roman era and its perseverance in the East after the fall of the West. As a result, much of the rich library of ancient literature has been lost to us. But let's say that you were in the distant past, without instant access to the world's library of knowledge. How exactly would you go about getting your hands on the literary works we've been discussing? Well, in this day and age, there was no printing press or means of automated mass production. Each work of literature would have been painstakingly written down. Authors might pen the original copy, but often simply dictated them. Drafts would then be edited and finalized until they could be released for copying. This Herculean task would be handled by armies of dedicated scribes and well-trained slaves. The material on which they wrote could vary greatly in cost and quality. Generally speaking, though, the most common literary medium was the papyrus scroll. Here, individual sheets would be glued together and wrapped around a pair of rods. Such scrolls were usually 3 to 15 meters in length, with the user revealing the text by slowly rolling the rods in sync. Around the 1st century BC, manufacturers began binding sheets of papyrus together into more compact notebooks and soon began to produce codices. While more expensive to make, these were praised as being far more compact, durable, easy to carry, and simpler to read than their predecessors. Thus, by the 4th century AD, they would see widespread adoption and largely replace the parchment scroll. Once produced, these written works could be bought from various vendors and street merchants. Martial, one of Rome's most famous poets, comments that one of his books could be bought new for as cheaply as 3 sesterces, about the daily wage for a manual laborer. Such low-tier items likely used poor quality papyrus and lacked any sort of embellishment. In fact, they were seen as so disposable that people would apparently use them as food wrappers. Just as today though, premium products existed as well. These would have better quality papyrus or might even upgrade to animal skin parchment and vellum. Colorful pigments, silver, and gold might be used as ink, with elaborate embellishments being added to the text. These high-tier books would usually be bought and sold by the rich as gifts or for their own collections. The author Lucian writes mockingly of how some collectors amassed massive libraries of Greek texts for the sake of appearing cultured, but without actually reading any of them. But books weren't doomed to end up as wrapping paper or pompous decoration. The ancient world actually had many public libraries where the general public could interact with literature. The Great Library of Alexandria is the most famous, but there were hundreds of others dotted across the empire. In fact, one of Julius Caesar's most popular reforms was to establish a major public library in Rome. It was completed by his heir Augustus, and soon, establishing public libraries became a popular practice for emperors throughout the next few centuries. One of the greatest of these, known as the Ulpian Library, was a public research center, apparently containing tens of thousands of scrolls in both Greek and Latin, as well as tools for the preservation of older documents. But these works did not just wait around waiting to be read. It seems that professionals made a habit of taking out books from public or private collections to be read in front of gatherings for both education and entertainment. I grin to imagine what such scenes would have been like for the excited crowds eagerly awaiting the newest midnight release of A True Story or The Golden Ass. At the same time, it pains me to know that there were so many works of Roman literature which have been lost to the ages. In any case, I hope you've appreciated this exploration of a sorely underappreciated aspect of our past. A big thanks once again to Daniel Greene for collaborating with us on this episode, and a huge thanks to our patrons for supporting the channel. Please consider becoming a member for early access to scripts and awesome art downloads. A big thanks as well to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.